Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in a minute, just giving everyone time to get on the call.
Okay, well, I think we can get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Emma Battaglia. I am from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and we are here today to talk about model zoning for accessory dwelling units. Thanks. Our agenda for today will include some background on why we are here, the regulations and the statute that have been put forth regarding accessory dwelling units. We'll go into our proposed model zoning that you can use in your local work to help comply with the new statute and regulations. So we'll kind of explain how that document is broken down. We'll go through a variety of annotations for each section of the zoning, which point out things you should do and not do and proceed with caution regarding in terms of how you structure your zoning. And then we have some appendices related to helping you comply with the checklist, and then also around design standards for historic districts. Lastly, we will give a few other items related to support and information, and then with whatever time we have left, we will use that for questions and answers. So any questions that you have throughout the meeting, if you could just put them in the Q&A box, and we will answer, as many as we can once the meeting gets started. And, we have time at the end. And again, this will be recorded, and you could find that on mass.gov/ADU. So our presenters today, me, obviously, I'm Emma Battaglia. I'm a senior planner for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and I'm joined by Gwendolyn Helen Sands from MAPC, who is a housing planner too, and also Alexis Smith will be joining us as well. And then Chris Kutchman is also going to be presenting, and she is the director of Livable Communities. And I'm going to hand it off to her now to give some background.
Thank you so much, Emma and Gwendolyn and MAPC. I'm so excited to be here today. Let's get into the next slide. When Governor Healy signed the Affordable Homes Act last August, the provision to change accessory dwelling units and have that change the Zoning Act be effective in February of 2025. It all seems so far away back in August, and I'm just really excited to be here today, providing resources for communities that need help in addressing and changing their zoning if they need to. To get to this point, we had a robust in public engagement process where we received almost 500 public comments through an online portal and held a public hearing. I'm here to let you know, we looked at every one of those comments and we reviewed every one. We made a number of changes from the draft regulations to the final. We tightened up the definition of transit station. We included pre-existing non-conforming lots. We kept more expansive definition of principal dwelling and single family zoning district. A lot of what we did was to add clarification to address confusion. And generally what EOHLC wanted to do was to strike an overall balance between a variety of interests, and still enabling and promoting accessory dwelling units across the Commonwealth. Next slide. So just to, level set here for everybody, we're talking about accessory dwelling units. We're going to have a lot more detailed discussion about the definitions that are in the regulations and also in the model zoning. But an accessory dwelling unit is a smaller dwelling unit that is near a principal dwelling. It can be detached, totally detached. It can be attached or an expansion of an existing principal dwelling. It can be interior inside an existing dwelling, such as an attic or a basement conversion. And it can be above an accessory structure, such as a garage. So lots of different kinds of ways that these small scale, units that are ideal for smaller households can be built on various properties. Next. So key highlights in the regulations include, just to make sure people are aware, accessory dwelling units were added by the Affordable Homes Act to be part of Section 3 of Chapter 40A, otherwise known as the Zoning Act. That's often referred to as the Dover Amendment section, and these are protected uses where the legislature and the governor have decided that these are uses that are so important that it needs to be clear that these uses cannot have some restrictions on them in terms of what local zoning can do. We have defined single family zoning district, which is an important definition in the regulations. That's any district where single family homes are allowed by right or by special permit, regardless of what it's named. Principal dwelling is a structure with a dwelling unit in a single family zoning district. It could be a duplex, a triplex, or multiple units. We probably expect that most accessory dwelling units will come from single family homes, but they are available to other principal dwellings. We have defined how dimensional standards can't be more restrictive than for a single family home or the principal dwelling or an accessory structure, whichever is more permissive in the local zoning. Next. Some other key highlights in the regulations is just to be clear that ADUs of 900 feet and larger can be allowed. And so I think you'll hear some of that as the MAPC team goes through the annotations, which they do proceed with caution and don't. And so some of that will be brought out there. And then we want to make sure that people understand we've defined in the regulation the protected use ADU, that there also can be local ADUs, and that's to try and deal with with ADUs that may pre-exist or maybe outside of the protected use definition. And finally, we want to be very clear that for short-term rentals, this is a municipal choice that is up to each municipality about whether you want to restrict or prohibit ADUs from becoming short-term rentals, or you want to promote them and to allow it. And so those are municipal choices. I advise everybody to review the ADU regulations, which are available on that mass.gov website, where you can pick up the regulations. If you're really familiar with the draft regulations, I believe we still have our track changes version of the draft to final regulations posted. Thanks so much. I'll be here for the questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Hi, my name's Gwendolyn. I'm going to jump in and take us through an introduction to what this model zoning document looks like and how it can be a resource to you all. Sorry. Okay, so the model zoning document is designed to be a guide to aid municipalities in adopting ADU zoning that is consistent with both the state statute and the state regulations for ADUs. The model zoning suggests different approaches to provide flexibility to be applied to and adopted in the diverse municipalities that are represented all across the state of Massachusetts. So it's not designed to be a one-size-fits-all, but more a starting point for you to adapt as you create your zoning. And it is intended to be a resource for both municipalities that have ADU zoning currently and are going to update it, as well as for municipalities who are creating ADU zoning for the first time. So as Chris mentioned, protected use ADUs versus local ADUs is a key part of this. The regulations created a new definition for protected use ADUs, which Emma is going to explain in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But we just want to note that that's something that you should really familiarize yourselves with, and we'll note throughout the zoning whether we're talking about if it's an area that applies just to protected use ADUs or to local ADUs, or both. So while the state requires that every municipality allow protected use ADUs, having local ADUs are optional for municipalities to have, and they apply to all other ADUs that are not protected use ADUs. So for example, one of the key pieces of a protected use ADU is that it may not be over 900 square feet. If a municipality would like to allow ADUs that are over 900 square feet, you can do that, but it would then be implemented as a local ADU type. And the model zoning includes suggestions for where regulations for local ADUs may be added and may be most applicable. So the document is organized, as Emma mentioned briefly at the beginning, we have an annotated version of the model zoning, then we have a clean version of the model zoning, and then we have two appendices. The annotated version includes the zoning text, and then it has commentary which is broken into do, proceed with caution, and don't categories. This means that for each section, there are comments that are guiding what should be included in your zoning, what's not allowed, and what may be allowed, depending on the situation of your municipality. And that's where we really put the proceed with caution. There are some areas that might apply to certain municipalities and not to others. The do is really, this is something you must have in your zoning, and don't is this is probably too restrictive or you cannot include this. We just want to note that the text between brackets, like we show here, indicates optional text. These are areas where there might be different numbers or different types of things that apply, that municipalities might put different things depending on what your needs are, or they might be areas that some municipalities will include and others will not. So that's our annotated version. Then our clean version is just the zoning text, and then we have two appendices. The first is a checklist for municipal planners, and the second is design standards for ADUs and historic districts, and I'll be walking us through those at the end of the presentation. Then a quick important notice, we want to highlight that this zoning is meant to be a guide for crafting your own zoning, but should be modified for each individual municipality before being adopted. So it's really designed so that it's a starting point. You can think about what we've put here, change what works for you better, what doesn't work. And then we really strongly encourage you to bring it to your legal counsel before adoption of the zoning. And you can contact HLC with any questions at this email that we have here, and we'll show this email again at the end. Okay, I'm going to pass off to Emma, who's going to take us through the model zoning and annotations itself.
Thank you, Gwen. So just a little background, we are going to, again, as Gwen mentioned, the model zoning will include the actual zoning text and then the annotations that can guide your local decision-making process. For this presentation, I'm not going to read through all of the zoning. I hope you guys look forward to really digging into that after this webinar. Instead, we're going to focus on those annotations and the different commentary that is meant to, help guide this process for you. Next slide. Great. The first section of the model zoning, typically the first section of a zoning ordinance or bylaw, is looking at the purpose. And so in this case, you'll want to state your local priorities in adopting the ADU bylaw or ordinance. We've provided some examples here that you might choose to use, and you can edit them as appropriate to reflect your local intention and any characteristics of your community that are worth noting. And then lastly, it's helpful to reference the enabling statute and the accompanying regulations. Next. In general, you should be wary of including any local purpose that might be at odds with the statement of purpose that's in the regulations, which is really the goal of increasing the production of housing to address statewide, local, and individual housing needs for households of all income levels and at all stages of life. A few things you should avoid. Again, don't state a purpose that could contradict the intention of the statute or the regulations. For example, a purpose related to owner occupancy or familial relationship would be very much against the intent. So you would not want to reference that. You don't want to state a purpose that is in violation of fair housing laws or indicates any form of local preference. So, for example, requiring it to be housing for families without children or current residents, students, income eligible households, housing tenure, etc., would all kind of contradict that statement of purpose. You'll also not want to state a purpose that indicates ADUs are only for affordable housing. While we know how important affordable housing is and we have this, dire need for it, that would be an example of a regulation that would be imposing, that would be prohibited because of the financial burdens that would impose on a regular property owner. One thing to note, though, in terms of the purpose around local preference and fair housing laws, you don't want to you don't want to restrict the number of bedrooms, but Title V provisions related to water and wastewater systems, those might impose limits on the number of bedrooms related to septic capacity. But something like that is outside, the realm of zoning. Next. Right, so we have a whole slew of definitions that you'll read in the model bylaw. A number of them come directly from the regulations, and then some of them are more local specific that we've provided examples of, and you might want to include those or something of the like. 3 definitions that I just want to point out here because you'll see them referenced a lot, and they're all very important and they're all slight variations on a similar thing. So accessory dwelling unit, I'm just going to read the full definition here because these are all really important. A self-contained housing unit inclusive of sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities on the same lot as a principal dwelling, subject to otherwise applicable dimensional parking requirements that maintain a separate entrance, either directly from the outside or through an entry hall or corridor shared with the principal dwelling, sufficient to meet the requirements of the building and fire code for safe egress. ADUs may be detached, attached, or internal to the principal dwelling. And we've included in the model zoning here that any general references to ADUs in this bylaw include both protected use ADUs and also the local ADUs that we've defined. So local ADUs are considered an ADU that is not a protected use ADU, and they include rules that are essentially specific to the municipality. And so you might choose to reference, your municipality's name or cross-reference an existing or proposed zoning section. And then the other key term is protected use ADU. So here we're talking about an attached, detached, or internal ADU that is located or proposed to be located on a lot in a single-family residential zoning district and is not larger in gross floor area than 1/2 the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. And then, important to note, and this is in brackets as it's optional, or a larger gross floor area if allowed by the municipality. Provided that only one ADU on a lot may qualify as a protected use ADU, and an ADU that is non-conforming to zoning shall still qualify as a protected use ADU if it otherwise meets this definition. In general, as you're working on the definition section, you'll want to review the existing definitions that are already in your local zoning bylaw, and you can add or amend as needed to make sure there's consistency across your local bylaw and the regulations and statute. We definitely encourage you to use definitions for key terms set forth in the regulations, like protected use ADU. Obviously, that's the one we're really trying to drill home, but there are lots of other definitions in there that should be helpful for you to include. Other things to do only include the relevant transit station definitions, and it's important to add existing definitions, add to the existing definitions section of your zoning bylaw. And you really want to make sure that there's consistency between the definition section, the general definition section, and any definitions that are in the specific ADU section. Next. So as we've alluded to a bit already, municipalities are allowed to use a broader, more permissive local definition of an ADU than the definition of protected use ADU in the regulations, as long as they're permittable by right and subject to all the protections afforded to a protected use ADU. So, for example, a municipality might already allow ADUs up to 1,200 square feet, and they want to continue allowing ADUs of that size. So the regulations allow a municipality to provide for more permissive regulations, as long as you know, the ADUs are still permittable by right and are subject to all the same protections. You should not use words that exist elsewhere in your zoning bylaw, but with another meaning. For example, if your zoning bylaw or ordinance already has a definition for ADU in the general definition section, you want to make sure it matches and is consistent with the definition in this specific section. Try to avoid using a different meaning for a term that exists in the regulations. For example, there can be sometimes different interpretations of what gross floor area means, but you want to make sure you're using the one that is in the regulations, because you don't want to lead to an inaccurate gross floor area count for those regulated protected use ADUs. And then lastly, don't include definitions from the regulations that aren't relevant. So an example would be historic districts. That is in the regulations, but if you don't have a historic district in your community, you don't need to include that. Next. All right, so now we're kind of getting into the meat of the model bylaw. And so the regulations are broken up into 5 main subsections. First, we cover some general provisions for all types of ADUs, specifically related to code compliance and then short-term rentals. Then we look at how you might authorize and how you should authorize protected use ADUs, and then a specific looks at the dimensional standards and off-street parking requirements that you might want to have in place there. Next, we give an example of how you could address a locally defined form of ADUs. So in this case, we give an example of a special permit for local ADUs, and we talk about how you would authorize that, and then go into dimensional standards and off-street parking for those, because it can look different than what it does for the protected use ADUs. Next, we cover the way you should approach the special permit for multiple ADUs on a lot, and then lastly, how to deal with nonconformance. Next. Sure, so the first item here is code compliance. you should specify that the protected use ADUs must comply with Title V, and specifically as it applies to a single-family residential dwelling. Don't try to regulate the building code in your zoning bylaw. Another thing you should not do is restricting the entrance location of a protected use ADU in relation to a principal dwelling. Protected use ADUs can maintain a separate entrance that is either directly from the outside or through an interior hall or corridor that's shared with the principal dwelling, as long as, you know, it's sufficient to meet safe egress under the building code. And then lastly, don't include more restrictive requirements than the state's, such as providing sewer capacity beyond what is required for a single-family residential dwelling. All right. Short-term rentals, that's an item that you may choose to be silent on, or you might want to address, because you might choose to approach short-term rentals for ADUs differently than you're approaching it for other types of units in your community. So these are just some optional ways that you can regulate it, since you are not required to allow for short-term rentals. You should certainly consider your municipal context, and if allowing short-term rentals for protected use ADUs meets your local goals and priorities. You should consider if allowing them, you know, is also supporting the purposes outlined in the regulations. And then there are definitely situations where it might make a lot of sense to allow for short-term rentals, but you want to handle it slightly differently. So for example, in a seasonal community, you might have a workforce that could really benefit from being able to rent by the week. And that might be something that you want to continue to make accessible. And so you might reference that. Regardless, you should not allow short-term rentals for protected use ADUs if they're not going to meet your local housing needs. Next. In terms of authorizing protected use ADUs, they should be allowed by right within or on lots with the principal dwelling. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, a principal dwelling is not just a single family residential dwelling. It could mean that, it could mean a duplex, it could mean a triple decker, a mixed use building, a multifamily building. And it's important to note, when there's already 2 or more units in a building on a lot, the entire structure, the entire existing structure becomes your principal dwelling. So in an example of a triple decker, the triple decker building would be the principal dwelling, not any specific unit in that triple decker. Also, you should make sure that the protected use ADUs are allowed in pre-existing non-conforming structures, and we'll talk more about that in the non-conformance section. You should allow all types of protected use ADUs, so that means attached, detached, or internal. And then in terms of how you might approve them, we recommend that either you allow your building commissioners to approve them by just building permit, or some communities have a process where your zoning administrator, which might be your planning staff, your planning director, can approve via administrative approval. Next. If you are choosing to require site plan review for protected use ADUs, that is allowed. However, any review guidelines must be clear, objective, and consistent with an as-of-right process. And you should consider, you know, and again, we kind of mentioned the Dover Amendment a lot, and we'll start mentioning it more as we continue through this presentation. But in an example of whether you're deciding whether or not to require site plan review, you should consider if that is appropriate in your particular case, especially if it requires approval of the special permit granting authority, and you would kind of apply that Dover Amendment analysis that is in the regulations to see if that would be considered reasonable. Another thing to be cautious of is imposing any restrictions on protected use ADUs that don't serve a legitimate municipal interest, such as, so, you know, an example of a legitimate municipal interest might be public safety. And so you might choose to limit the number of curb cuts on a lot, because you want to make it safe for pedestrians, and that wouldn't necessarily impose unreasonable costs. So that might make a lot of sense in one community, but in other communities that have really large lots, allowing a separate driveway might make perfect sense. And they aren't necessarily walkable locations anyway. So that's why, really for any one of these regulations, your building commissioner or zoning administrator will need to apply that Dover analysis. In terms of things you should avoid, don't require a special permit from the special permit granting authority for protected use ADUs within or on lots with a principal dwelling. As you know, we've mentioned and will continue to mention, special permits are required though for any additional ADU built on a lot with a protected use ADU. Next, okay. So we spend a lot of time in the model zoning kind of breaking down how you should structure dimensional standards and some suggestions based on the type of community you live in and, you know, generally how big your lots are. So you should allow protected use ADUs that are not larger than a gross floor area of 900 square feet or 1/2 the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, whichever is smaller, unless your municipality chooses to allow larger. But again, you would have to still have, you know, all the other factors in place that apply to a protected use ADU. But that can be one item that is, because it's more permissive, it would be allowed. You want to make sure you want to make sure that you are imposing dimensional standards that are not more restrictive than for the principal dwelling or for the accessory structure, whichever is more permissive. So an example of that would be, if you're comparing an existing house and where you might want to put your ADU, and you're comparing what the requirements are for a single family residential home versus an accessory structure. If the principal dwelling is allowed up to 2 stories in height, whether or not that's allowed for the accessory structure, that is what would be most permissive in this case. So your ADU would have to allow up to 2 stories. In the same vein, in terms of setback, if your principal structure requires 20 feet of setback, but your accessory structure only requires 10 feet, you would have to go with 10 feet because that is the most permissive. And you should review your existing dimensional standards and continue and, you know, consider how they might apply to protected use ADUs in particular. Another thing I just want to point out is that in this section, we reference, if, you know, an example of basically referencing your existing dimensional standard section and referencing an existing accessory structure section that you might already have in your bylaw. The reason being is you might choose to change those numbers, and that way you can only have to change that section of your bylaw. You don't then have to go back and change the ADU bylaw as well. So if you just kind of reference that section, that can, you know, simplify the process a little bit. Next. You should consider whether existing dimensional standards in your zoning bylaw might pose unreasonable restrictions, particularly given the purpose that is set out in the regulations to increase housing production and provide affordable places for people to live. You should consider whether dimensional standards would unreasonably prevent protected use ADUs from being built in existing structures like a detached garage or a barn. And then again, you'll want to apply that Dover amendment analysis to determine if preventing protected use ADUs, for example, from being in the front yard is reasonable. There are certain contexts, such as in corner lots and in lower density or rural areas with large lots, where it might be appropriate to allow them and unreasonable to prohibit under the Dover analysis. In terms of things you want to avoid, you cannot require lot size minimums. They are not allowed as the regulations explain. And you also can't impose dimensional standards that are stricter than required for the principal dwelling, a single family residential dwelling, or accessory structure within the same district. And we kind of already explained how you would do that comparison. Next. Great, so we're gonna go into a little bit more detail on the process for establishing dimensional standards for protected use ADUs. This kind of is repetitive, but is bear repeating. So you'll want to review your existing standards and consider how they might apply to protected use ADUs to result in the most permissive regulation. You should consider if any of your dimensional standards could preclude the creation of ADUs in any of your zoning districts. And if that's true, you should figure out what more lenient dimensional standards might make sense to apply specifically to ADUs. And we will walk through some diagrams that provide examples. Lastly, consider if your dimensional standards would allow for existing detached structures to be added onto or converted to a protected use ADU. And again, if you see limitations, you should consider adapting standards to better allow for those kind of additions and conversions. Next. Great. So in the first example you see here of a small lot, this kind of shows an average lot and setback for a small lot of 7,000 square feet. And with the existing assumed conditions, it would even be difficult to fit a 600 square foot ADU on the lot. And so if the lot also included a large driveway or garage, it would be nearly impossible to fit an ADU within those existing setbacks. So for municipalities with similar urban areas or lot sizes, it might be recommended to consider decreased setbacks as it applies to ADUs. In the example here of a medium-sized lot, the existing assumed conditions could fit a 900 square foot ADU that is detached. But if the lot were to include a larger dwelling, a garage, or another accessory structure, it might also be difficult to fit the ADU. So with municipalities with similar lot sizes, again, consider decreased setbacks, and also consider if your bulk and height restrictions would allow such a structure, such as a detached garage or a carriage house, to be converted into a protected use ADU. And in general, allowing more flexible bulk and height regulations will make those conversions possible in a greater number of circumstances. Next. Lastly, in this example of a larger lot on almost half an acre, you see you could quite easily fit a 900 square foot ADU. While a lot of this size would have less trouble fitting an ADU, even with additional structures or features, the setbacks may be larger than necessary for considering an ADU placement. So you might still be able to place one closer than the setbacks allowed, but still it would not impose on your neighbors at all. So for any of these examples, you'll want to think hard about your local conditions and make decisions based on that. Next. Okay, the regulations are pretty explicit on off-street parking requirements for protected use ADUs. You are not allowed to require them within a half mile of the transit station, and you can only require up to one outside of that half-mile radius. So you'll want to decide if you want to require the parking space for protected use ADUs located outside of the transit radius, or if you're not going to require any additional parking. And you should not require parking for protected use ADU within a half mile of a transit station. And in general, you should consider the walkability and pedestrian safety of your municipality to determine if it makes sense to not require any parking. And a municipality has discretion to reasonably determine the center point from which that half-mile radius is calculated. Next. Okay, well, so that completes the protected use ADU section. So this section here on the special permit for local ADUs, this is totally optional, but is a way that you might choose to address a locally defined ADU in your bylaw. So first, determine if it makes sense to allow for another ADU type besides a protected use ADU, and then figure out if it makes sense to allow that by right, through site plan review, or by special permit. You should determine what additional allowances you would want to provide for the ADU development or use outside of the protected use definition. And then, given that you're kind of requiring that extra letter, given that you're kind of already requiring the additional special permit process here, you might kind of want to include some incentives there. You should continue, as the regulations specify, to create a special permit process for any properties that would like to create an additional U after the first protected use ADU that's allowed by right. And be aware that allowing any ADUs that don't meet the definition and requirements for protected use ADU is that would be allowed in addition to a protected use ADU. And it's really important to drill that home because you cannot deny a protected use ADU on a lot that you know, is afforded those protections by the legislature. So if you want to also allow for these local ADUs, which you totally can, you should be aware that that would be in addition to the protected use ADU. Next. Looking specifically at dimensional standards, similar kind of exercise, but you should determine the maximum gross floor area and dimensional standards that you would want to allow for an ADU that is not a protected use ADU. And as I briefly mentioned, if you are going to require the approval of a special permit, that kind of extra layer that the property owner has to go through, you might want to include some kind of incentive. For example, allowing a larger ADU. Next. For off-street parking, you are allowed, you know, you're not kind of bound by those same regulations on how much parking that you include, but you should determine if you would like to require parking for ADUs that are not protected use ADUs, both within and outside that transit station radius. You may require parking within the half-mile radius, but you should really consider if it's necessary. Next. We've kind of gone through this one a lot, but when regulating multiple ADUs on a lot, you do want to require a special permit if you are choosing to allow additional ADUs on the same lot as a protected use ADU. That is optional. You don't have to allow them, but if you do, you have to require a special permit. The last section of the regulations looks at nonconformance, and this is touched upon pretty specifically in the regulations. But you want to allow protected use ADUs by right within or on lots with a pre-existing nonconforming structure. That the regulations are, you know, pretty explicit in that. That was something that was really kind of clarified in the final draft of the regulations. You should consider whether it's reasonable under the Dover analysis to require a finding pursuant to Chapter 40A, Section 6 for expansion or alteration of a pre-existing non-conforming structure. And if you are going to require that finding, you should ensure that you're providing a clear and objective process by the special permit granting authority. You don't want to prevent an ADU that is non-conforming to zoning from qualifying as a protected use ADU if it otherwise meets the definition. That kind of comes right from the regulations. And you should not require a special permit for development of a protected use ADU where the lot or structure is non-conforming. Section 6 of Chapter 48 provides that a finding under this section can be made by the permit granting authority or the special permit granting authority. And so kind of read in combination with Section 3's prohibition on special permits as they apply to development of protected use ADUs. A special permit is not required and therefore not allowed for this purpose. The last section of the model zoning bylaw deals with administration and enforcement. So you should make sure to follow all building code and zoning requirements when building new ADUs or converting a space into an ADU. That applies to all ADUs, not just protected use ADUs. And you may choose to provide a limited waiver for occasional circumstances where a normally reasonable regulation would be unreasonable as applied to a particular lot. And the Dover Amendment is meant to be like a heavily fact-based analysis that looks at overall zoning, but also on a lot-by-lot basis. And so, for example, a requirement that protected use ADU be beside or behind the principal dwelling might not be reasonable as applied to a large lot where the principal dwelling has a really big front yard and, you know, already it's sitting along the rear setback. All right, well, I'm gonna hand it back to Gwendolyn to go through the appendices section, and then she'll talk about some additional supports and we will go into the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Emma, and thank you everyone for sticking through us through the nitty-gritty zoning here. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly go through the appendices. As we mentioned earlier, our first appendix is this checklist for municipal planners. This is the whole thing shown here. It's only 2 pages, so it's really meant to be like a quick how-to of all the steps to take when crafting your zoning and all the key things to include or to keep in mind. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by the longer model zoning annotated document, this could be a good place to start to make sure you're thinking through everything in the correct way. And then Appendix B is design standards for ADUs in historic districts. So design standards may be applied to ADUs only that are located in historic districts, but the standards must be measurable and objective. And the state regs also state that these standards cannot be so restrictive, excessive, burdensome, or arbitrary to prohibit, render infeasible, or unreasonably increase the costs of the use or construction of a protected use ADU. So those are sort of the 2 things to keep in mind when you're determining how to apply design standards to protected use ADUs. Specific standards will need to be tailored to the architectural character of each municipality and each district. So this is an area that we've left very flexible because it will really need to be determined based on the very specific district that each ADU is located in. So as I mentioned, these standards have to be measurable and objective. So these are 4 examples of design standards that may be reasonable because they can meet these requirements. So roof pitch, window scale and dimension, window coverage, utility screening, these are all things that can have very specific standards that could be measurable. An example of something that would not be allowed, which is common in a lot of historic districts, is the requirement that a building fit within the architectural character of the historic district. That is not a standard that is measurable or objective and therefore cannot be enforced on protected use ADUs. So for this section, we have a similar do, don't, proceed with caution. Notes here. For a do category, we note that you are allowed to apply design standards to protected use ADUs within historic districts. This is specific because you are not allowed to apply design standards to protected use ADUs if they are not within a historic district. We encourage you to determine which of your existing standards for historic districts are measurable and objective and therefore can be applied to these protected use ADUs that might be added in these districts. But you are not allowed to restrict the development of ADUs in historic districts through overly limiting design standards. And then proceed with caution. A note here that some historic districts have only apply to structures that are visible from the main thoroughfare. So if this is something you have in your municipality or in a specific district, it's really important to consider this in the context of ADUs because oftentimes they may be in the backyard or they may be internal, and therefore they might not be visible from the main street, and therefore these standards would not apply to them if this is something you have in your municipality. And then design guidelines, which are separate from design standards. Design guidelines are more of a suggestion of how buildings can be designed in a district. You can give design guidelines for protected use ADUs in historic districts, but they cannot be legally enforced because they're not a legal document. They're just meant to provide guidance. So we just want to note that here. Okay, and then this is our last section before we jump into the Q&A. Just going to talk through some additional supports and information that are available to you as you're navigating this process of crafting ADU zoning or understanding this new ADU law. So continued technical assistance is available to you through the Attorney General's office. Expanded guidance on administration, enforcement, and FAQs will be posted on the EOHLC's ADU webpage. And then coming up on March 25th, the Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition is hosting an hosting a webinar on ADUs in historic landscapes. So if you want to learn more about how ADUs will be can be applied in historic districts, this is a great webinar to attend. And I'm actually helping to run this webinar as well, so hope to see you all there. And then for more information, the EOHLC has a web page specifically on ADUs, which is a great resource linked here. MAPC, we also have a web page all about ADUs. You can email EOHLC at this email address here with any questions. And then if you want to receive updates about the Affordable Homes Act implementation, you can sign up on the EOHLC webpage. And I also want to mention that we should have mentioned at the beginning that the document of this model zoning is live as of today, and it's on the EOHLC ADU webpage. So you can find that there at this first link. It's under the model zoning, and there's the full document with our annotated and our clean version. Okay, so that is it for me, and I'm going to pass it off to my HLC colleagues who are going to take us into our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gwen and Emma, for that awesome overview. I know it's a lot of detail, and for the folks online as well, thank you for bearing with us. We've been really pushing to get this model zoning out to help municipalities, both update their zones ordinances as well. So we hope this session is helpful. We're going to run through a number of the different questions that we've received just through the Q&A feature. If you have additional questions, please do put them in as well, as we will review them. And they do also help us with preparing additional material later on. So our FAQ as well, that will be kind of forthcoming. And we are rolling out more and more information on this as well in the future. So I would just make a note of that. So thank you for that. I think I'll start with, I also want to pass on, so the AGO's office, the Attorney General's office, is working with a number of municipalities in updating and reviewing, so both towns and cities, their their own zoning bylaws. So I would note that they will be following up directly with a number of towns and cities in the coming few weeks. So they mentioned just to pass along that message as well. With that, I'm going to start off. I'll field questions between Chris and Roy moving forward. And please do, both of you as well, feel free to jump in if there's a question that you'd like to respond to as well. So for Chris, what if a municipality doesn't want to allow ADUs overall? So prohibiting ADUs.
So because this law was effective on February 2nd, a municipality may no longer prohibit accessory dwelling units. They must allow for a protected use ADU in single-family zoning districts in accordance with the additional details that are in the regulations. So municipalities can no longer say you cannot have an accessory dwelling unit.
Awesome. And a follow-up question on that as well, just kind of in terms of an overview, Chris. When do municipalities need to make sure that they are in line with these changes to the ADU law?
So municipalities, a best practice is to set about amending your zoning bylaws or ordinances to be consistent with these regulations. However, if you don't amend your zoning bylaws, so for example, thinking about if you were a property owner and you wanted to submit something now and your town still has outdated zoning that, for example, might require owner occupancy, require familial relationship, require a special permit. All three of those things are no longer allowed. So if you are a property owner and you wanted to put something forward, your town could not enforce those provisions that are inconsistent with the law and the regulations.
Awesome, thank you, Chris. I might have Roy maybe respond to this one. So we restrict a maximum of 4 unrelated persons in a single family home. Why not allow the same cap in ADUs, usually smaller than a primary dwelling, without being considered an unreasonable regulation?
Roy Montoya, I'm one of the attorneys at EOHLC. I helped with the with the regulations. So there's really 2 pieces to this, and the first is that Section 3, the Dover Amendment, does not allow regulation of the internal space of the ADU, so you can't regulate the number of bedrooms. The regulations define use and occupancy restriction, which is prohibited, as including a limit to the number of occupants. So taken together, and clearly from the definition, you cannot.
Great, thank you, Roy. Another follow-up one again, kind of in the similar kind of like vein. If there is a local ADU already on a parcel, does the community have to allow a protected ADU on the property in addition to the local ADU?
So some ADUs, so an existing ADU might be a protected use ADU, right? So if it meets the definition, it's 900 square feet or half the size, up to half the size of the home, then it may meet the definition. So certain prohibited restrictions would no longer be enforceable, as Chris said. And so it would be a protected use ADU already. And if it is, then you would not have to permit or allow another ADU on the lot. If it's larger than 900 square feet, the municipality would need to determine through their zoning whether they're permitting those larger protected use ADUs. If they are, then that would be a protected use ADU. If they are not permitting the larger protected use ADUs, then it wouldn't be. And so the homeowner would have the right to build another, an actual protected use ADU.
Awesome, thank you, Roy. A follow-up question just on kind of like size limitations as well. I might get you to feel this one too. Is there a minimum or maximum lot size to qualify for ADUs larger than 900 square feet? And is there a restriction on how many bedrooms and occupants can be allowed? So these are again the larger ADUs.
Yeah, so protected use ADUs can be more permissive, but not more restrictive. So if it's going to be a protected use ADU, it needs to meet the definition of a protected use ADU, and it needs to have all of the same protections of a protected use ADU. Right, so you can be more permissive by adding size, but you can't add restrictions.
Thank you. And one for Chris. From the latest final regs, am I correct in that a town can require a special permit for a protected use ADU in a water supply protection district?
Sure. This was one of the changes that we made after hearing lots of public comments and requests for clarification. There are aquifer protection districts and floodplain districts that it makes sense, and many communities have special permits in those areas. So you can require that special permit. However, the special permit criteria must be on its face clear and objective. And many of these environmental regulations, such as such as floodplains and water protection districts, do have very specific criteria that can be clear and objective. For example, must be built, a foot over the elevation of the highest flood area. So that would be an example of a clear and objective standard. So you can do that by special permit, but it must be clear and objective. I should note here that, many of the questions that we have and the things that we're talking about are really in the weeds and quite complex and will matter individually, for every, jurisdiction. And so we do advise that you talk to your town council or city solicitor as you're developing new zoning to make sure that, your certain situation in your community is taken into account. As was mentioned, the Attorney General's office has been very generous with their offer to outreach to municipal council, and I would take them up on that offer. But I do, so we're going to do our best to answer as many questions here as we can today. But for municipal staff, talking to town council or city solicitor is always a good idea.
That's a great reminder, Chris. And I think actually as well, the document prepared by MAPC as well will answer a number of questions that we've received as well. So I think it's just a case of municipal staff taking the time to really digest what's in the model zoning. And actually the way that MAPC have laid out the document with the do not and proceed with caution. I think that really gives or should give municipal staff a real sense of, how to apply some of the regulations as well at that more local level. So that's a really good reminder overall. We'll take maybe a few more questions, just maybe, and I think maybe another 2 questions, and we can kind of maybe wrap up actually, no, we've got maybe a few more as well. Okay, so question to Roy, is a tiny home with wheels, needing a permanent foundation on a property considered an ADU? And if so, are there any tiny home models that would be approved that would meet the current regulations? Thank you.
Tiny home fits within our definition of modular or mobile home, the idea that it's on wheels. They have to be affixed to a foundation and they have to be connected to external utilities. So those are the requirements for them to qualify. And in terms of whether I'm sure that there are tiny homes that would qualify. I don't have a list though.
Okay, no problem. And we have been actually working with and we've heard from a number of smaller prefabricated ADU builders across the state who given us kind of some information about this as well. So it's definitely a developing sector here in Massachusetts overall. Roy, we've had a few questions on the Dover Amendment and kind of how the ADU regulations fit within Section 3 and some of what that means and some of the consequences around that. Would you mind just giving another kind of brief explanation to the group about kind of how that applies and what some of the considerations around that might be?
Yeah, there will be some resources provided by the Attorney General's office where they'll give a lot more detail, and I think that'll be interesting. But generally speaking, the Dover Amendment is over 70 years old. It was designed to protect uses that were traditionally discriminated against. So protecting religious uses, education, childcare, and municipalities cannot prohibit those uses. They can only reasonably restrict them. And what that means has been defined by the court over that entire period of time. So the regulations that we've written are an articulation of the case law as it's developed over that time. That's the standard that's in the regulation. That's where it comes from. The consequences of Dover is that people have a right to appeal through whatever their municipal process is, and they ultimately have a right to court action if they feel that some regulation is prohibited or some regulation is unreasonable. The purpose of the regulations, though, is to make sure that we are providing guardrails, that we're working with municipalities to develop bylaws that work for their municipalities, and to try and prevent that sort of litigation from having to happen. So that's the consequence. But I think what we should be looking out for is, I think we'll get some more resources on that out, and I think that'll be good for everyone to see.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. Yeah, and so that guidance should be forthcoming from the Attorney General's office as well. And there's a few issues that kind of be covered off, and we're just kind of we're hearing them back from the municipalities, creating that guidance, and then we'll be kind of sending that out in the kind of coming weeks. Another question on lot coverage. More specifically, can lot coverage be enforced as a restriction, or for the development of an ADU on a lot, or like based on size? Warrior Chris?
I believe it fits within the dimensional requirements, so it is something that can be required. But I think it's a cautionary tale, right? Everything that is regulated by the municipality, everything that they regulate has to be reasonable. Everything has to, it has to be reasonable as per that analysis is in the regulations that's created by Dover. So yes, it can be required, but there might be a lot or a neighborhood where lot coverage might not be a reasonable regulation, because it might result in a de facto prohibition on development. It is very fact dependent, and it's going to be very unique to each municipality.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Another question here. I have a 3-family home located in a residential zoning district, but it is not my principal dwelling. Would this affect my ability to use my currently built garage and create an ADU?
Yeah, so principal dwelling refers to not where you live. It refers to the principal dwelling on the lot. So every lot that has a dwelling unit or structure is going to have a principal dwelling. So if you owned a triple decker, you have a garage, and you wanted to convert that to an ADU, you own the whole lot, the whole building. You would be able to pursue that development. It would need to be in conformance with the building code and all the requirements, regulations for the town. But yes, you could do so.
Awesome, thank you, Roy. Question for Chris in relation to short-term rentals, which has obviously come up a bit as well. Can you explain the rules around short-term rentals and how the length of time applies for how it might be considered as well?
Sure. So short-term rentals, just to be very clear, are a choice that by municipalities. You can choose to restrict them or prohibit them, or you can choose to allow them. The short-term rental regulations that you may have in your community already, should you already regulate them, are not actually affected by the accessory dwelling unit regulations. But in allowing for protected use ADUs, you may want to think about those regulations and how they apply to these protected use ADUs. If you have questions about this, again, we're going to direct you to legal counsel. And we get a lot of questions about what's the length of time? What defines a short-term rental? Is it 31 days? Is it 6 months? Is it less than 31 days? And again, there's further guidance coming on this from the Attorney General's office. And again, we send you to the regulations, and the statute actually cross-reference a statute about short-term rental regulations. And so we, again, if you have those already, we recommend that you think about those and then also refer back to the statute. I think it's 64G, chapter 64G, as in go. So that's the short-term rental situation. Again, the big takeaway is it is the municipality's choice about how and whether to regulate ADUs as short-term rentals. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Chris. Another one maybe for you, Chris, that you might be able to respond to. This is kind of about I know this has kind of come up a little bit, but there is just a question about like size limitations. My understanding is that that the regulations only permit ADUs up to 900 square feet. I have a 1,200 square foot ADU already constructed in my municipality. Are these now considered protected use ADUs?
I think Roy tried to answer this one earlier, and I think some of this is repetition. And maybe those of you who are zoning nerds like me will want to review the recording of this and listen carefully to the questions. But you can, if there are a 1,200 square foot existing ADU could be a protected use ADU if there are no other restrictions on it. That is, if it doesn't have a requirement to have owner occupancy or familial relationship, or other, or a special permit to maintain it. Those are the kinds of restrictions that would not make it not a protected use ADU. However, in the municipality, if they chose to say that existing ADUs up to a certain square footage would become protected use ADUs, that is municipality's choice as they're developing their zoning regulations. And if you have existing accessory dwelling units in your community, we advise that you think about that in particular. They can be larger than 900 square feet and still qualify as a protected use ADU. There's obviously an interaction with that. And whether again, another municipal choice is whether you allow for more than one ADU on a lot, as long as you have a protected ADU. And so you may want to think about those things together.
Thank you, Chris. Maybe a question to either of you as well. Is there a cap on the number of additional ADUs that can be added to an existing lot beyond the second one?
No, I think that would be a municipality's choice. I think it might be unusual that would happen. But again, it's a municipality's choice about whether to allow more than a protected use ADU on a lot. Roy, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's right. And there are municipalities that allow more than one single family home on a lot, for example. So, I mean, they could choose to allow more than one ADU. The statute provides for that, but it requires a special permit for more than one.
Okay, thank you. And so I'm just taking a look through these questions as we go through them. If a protected use ADU is built attached to a principal dwelling, is the setback that applies to the principal dwelling or the accessory shed, barn or garage? So just about the dimensional standards and kind of overall the interpretation of that one. Roy, do you want to speak to how that applies and how we consider
Well, the regulations require for development of protected use ADU that essentially it's like a sliding scale, right? So you're required to use, I think, the lowest, if I'm remembering this correctly.
The most permissive?
Yeah, the most permissive regulation. Yeah, so it can be the accessory structure, principal dwelling, or single family, depending on what the principal dwelling is being developed. So there's still a setback, most likely, but it would be whatever's most permissive.
Let's just give an example here. Let's say that you're in a community and your setback for a detached garage is 10 feet, but your setback for a single family dwelling is 20 feet. The setback requirement for the attached for the ADU portion would be 10 feet. That's my understanding.
Mine too.
Okay, great. We got a question about what should someone do if their local zoning is contrary to what the new law or regs require. So I would note that, look, not every municipality has a chance to have updated their zoning bylaw at this point, and we ask you to kind of be patient with the cities and towns as they go forward with this. And we're in a moment where we're all updating our kind of regulations, but if there is, if you're kind of noting that there is significant pushback on accepting them, we ask, our advice would be to, try and convince your municipality to change the zoning. And in the meantime, it's okay to propose a protected use ADU that does not comply with local zoning, and the municipality should greenlight it anyway. If protected use ADU gets denied or improperly limited by a municipality based on the local law, then the property owner has a right to judicial review as well. So I would just note that there is a process around that as well, but I think it's just, we'd ask you to kind of try and be patient with cities and towns in the meantime as well. What else I'm just taking a look. Chris and Roy, if there are other questions as well that you have noticed in the chat, I know that we have covered quite a bit of stuff at this.
Catherine, yeah, let me, there are a couple questions about addressing, and I just want to say we've been working very closely with MassGIS, building inspectors, and the groups of professionals who are the building inspectors, as well as public safety officials about addressing. Addressing of the ADU is required. Again, we're continuing to work with them on some standards so that the building officials or your public safety folks for municipalities should understand how ADUs and a principal dwelling would be addressed and what changes that would be. So that there is consistency. This is very important for public safety purposes to make sure that if there's a detached ADU that the police and fire know that it's there and know that there's a separate unit that might need to be evacuated, for example. It's also important for other purposes so that mail can be delivered and things like that. So we want to let people know we're working closely with those groups to figure out some addressing standards.
Thank you, Chris. And actually also noting we are working with other departments across the state as well to ensure that we have kind of consistent regulations in relation to this as well. So, it would be worth kind of noting that there are other agencies that are updating and amending their guidance around ADUs, and we hope to kind of post that on our page as well. But that would be worth kind of noting. We're working quite closely with groups like the building inspectors as well. So just kind of noting that guidance as well is kind of forthcoming at the moment, and those groups are all they're also doing kind of road shows to get the word out too. We've had talking about building inspectors. There was a couple of questions and a good few questions about the calculation of the gross floor area, like within the regulations and how it should be calculated. I would say this is something that you should definitely take a look at. It's quite specific, the definition of the gross floor area. Calculating from the internal walls, like overall as well. So we've updated that definition in the regulations kind of recently as well. So I would highly suggest you take a look at that or have a building official review that for you as well on your behalf. Where am I? Okay, so there. Okay, so may there be a requirement for a protected use ADU to be no further from the principal dwelling than a certain distance? Question here from someone in the chat. I think that I'm not sure actually the model bylaw speaks to distance requirements. I think we've gone into some guidance around whether would it be an unreasonable restriction to place ADUs in a front garden. Or to the front of a lot. So I would say that would be something to maybe review in a bit more detail through the model zoning as well on that one. Unless there's anything from Chris or Roy on that one.
It's all subject to the reasonableness. The regulations don't necessarily address all possible things that a municipality might deem necessary to regulate, but it is all subject to a Dover analysis. And so that's something you'd have to talk with your legal counsel over.
Okay. We had a question. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just was looking at some of the questions, and one of the questions was about accessory dwelling units counting on the subsidized housing inventory, and I do want to address this. In the next decennial census, so the subsidized housing inventory, otherwise known as SHI, is part of the law, the Chapter 40B law, and its regulations and its guidelines. That law requires that the decennial census, so the one that is taken every 10 years, update the year-round housing units in a community. So in 2030, when the census conducts its next decennial census, ADUs that have addresses will receive a census form and they will fill it out. So they will be counted as part of the year-round housing units, as long as they are in fact year-round housing units. If, for example, it's a short-term rental, it would not count as a year-round housing unit. So it's possible that a community's year-round housing units will go up because of accessory dwelling units. They do not qualify automatically as affordable units, but they will be added into the denominator of the subsidized housing inventory as part of that 2030 year-round housing units. That is generally done approximately the recalculation of subsidized housing inventory percentages usually happens approximately 2 years after the census, because it actually takes the census quite a bit to come out with the year-round housing units.
Thank you, Chris. That's helpful. Another question here, is there guidance about what exactly counts as a transit station? So we have noted that there are different kind of modes of transportation that get included in a transit station. And again, the model zoning is written with kind of in square brackets. You kind of you need to determine which of the transit modes then applies to your specific town or city. So there's a good explanation within both the regulations, I would say now the updated regulations, and also the model zoning.
And I would add, and Emma and Gwendolyn covered this in their presentation, and so it's in the model zoning, in that it is up to the community to decide what is that center point of a transit station. For example, if you have a commuter rail station, it's often actually more of a linear thing than a certain point, like a bus stop. But so it is at your discretion where that half-mile radius will be drawn. For consistency, you should use, the same methodology generally. Emma, do you have anything else to add about that? I just wanted to note that you had mentioned that, and the model does point that out.
Nope, nothing else.
Okay, there is again another question about the placement of an ADU on an existing lot. Can I place an ADU anywhere within the setbacks if I wanted to hide an ADU behind a detached garage furthest from the primary dwelling? Again, this would kind of go back to the reasonableness test that we've kind of described as well kind of previously. If a property owner seeks to build an ADU now before the municipality has adopted zoning consistent with the new state law, like how might that be affected? I notified you of kind of some of the guidance from the AGO's office on that one. Okay, it's a lot of kind of repeat questions, so I'm just gonna kind of rolling through those because I don't want to I just want to make sure we get as many of these kind of questions answered as possible. Okay.
Someone again asks, is there a deadline for municipalities to create rules? As we have stated, municipalities, we again recommend as a best practice that municipalities update their zoning to make sure that it is consistent with state law and these regulations. However, they're not mandated to change their zoning to do that, but they could not enforce zoning that had, things like requiring owner occupancy, requiring a special permit to approve an ADU, requiring a familial relationship. So if the municipality does not do that, if they don't change their zoning, a property owner could come forward and, with an application for a protected use ADU, and they would have to approve it. We feel like it's, as land use planners, from my perspective, we feel like it is, again, a best practice for the zoning to kind of articulate what the rules are in the community. But this is a case where if the community does not amend their zoning, it just could not enforce it.
Okay, question.
Again, I think we hit on this from in the very beginning of, I'm sorry, Catherine, of the question and answers, but just to be clear, a municipality may not prohibit accessory dwelling units under this new state law and under the regulations. So I think we just want to be clear about that in case people missed it. Also, this webinar and the recording of this webinar will be posted on mass.gov/ADU. And we'll also post the deck that was used in this presentation as well. So those resources will be available to folks. And again, we have a lot of those repeat questions that people ask if you joined late.
Great. If there's no other, are there any other specific questions, Chris, that yourself or Roy want to address? Roy, is there something non-conforming?
There was a question about there was a question about non-conforming structures, so whether someone had a carriage house that was non-conforming, whether that could be used for a protected use ADU by right. So a municipality cannot prohibit development of protected use ADU in a non-conforming structure, so long as it can be done in accordance with the building code, made habitable. There is a general Mass General Laws 48, Section 6. There's a section on non-conforming structures that says that the permit granting authority or special permit granting authority can make a finding that it doesn't extend the use, the nonconformance or the nature of the nonconformance. So that finding needs to be made in an as of right way, right? Because special permit cannot be used for purposes of a protected use ADU. So there is some regulations that may be reasonable in terms of whether or not the non-conforming structure would be appropriate for the protected use ADU, but it would have to be in an as of right way. And that's in the bylaw as well. There's the section on non-conformance, and I think that addresses it pretty well.
So I do want to just let folks know MAPC folks covered additional resources. Those are really focused on zoning and municipalities. Our outreach right now is really is focused on municipalities and property owners that are interested in accessory dwelling units. There's a lot more to accessory dwelling units than just the zoning that's going to permit them. And we're going to be continuing to work on financing options for accessory dwelling units, outreach to the appraisal community, outreach to the assessing community, working with realtors to make sure they understand the new laws and rules, because this is something that is going to come up in sales transactions. Again, continuing to work with the building commissioners and the public safety folks on making sure that the addressing goes forward and is provided for folks. So I just want to let folks know we're not done. There'll be more to come, including a design competition to put forward some potential exciting designs and get some of our young or emerging designers engaged in developing potential templates, plans for accessory dwelling units. So please keep tuned if you're interested in accessory dwelling units to mass.gov/ADU, and the MAPC ADU webpage is also excellent. Catherine, any more questions come in?
Yeah, just one last one, Chris, and then I think that's like our final one for this afternoon. It's when it comes to requirements for utilities, basically, what does compliance look like? And we would say in this one to defer to the state requirements, that municipalities cannot be more stringent about the rules in terms of how they are applied overall for ADUs. But yeah, I think noting, we're continuing to work on this material, moving forward, and we will take a look at all the questions in more detail after this. And, we hope to get more content out as well on the ADU work as it continues to roll forward. I want to say a big thank you to all our presenters today, Chris Clutchman and Montoya for asking questions. And again, to the staff at MAPC, Emma and Gwen, you both did an incredible job putting all that work together. So we really hope this has been a useful session for everybody. Emma, I'll pass back to you, and then you might want to close out the session.
Sure. I don't really have anything else to add other than what you shared. I would just encourage you again to go to the EOHLC ADU webpage and the MAPC ADU webpage. I know that since we don't have a chat, we weren't able to send the links, so you might not have caught the link to the Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition meeting. So just know that you'll be able to get that link on the slides, and we'll also have event information on the MAPC ADU webpage. So go to either of those two sites and you should be able to access everything that you need. And please reach out to the EOHLC email, or you could always reach out to MAPC if you have any questions. All right.
Great. Okay. Awesome. We're good to close it down.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.